let's talk about Swift. So Swift is a global system, and it's like a messaging queue. Swift transports money, but of course it's not a physical transport. It's transporting information about money. Information between different players, different jurisdictions, different infrastructure, different organizations, different policies, and a lot of money, which makes it a very attractive target for attackers. And every now and then there is news about Swift hacks, but it's kind of hard to find or meet somebody who's looked into this, into several of these hacks, and saw the pattern behind it, and thought enough about this to tell us what we can learn from it, what we can learn from the Swift hacks and apply in our systems that we're building. Please welcome Oliver Simonnet for MVR Security in the UK.
Are we working? Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Okay. So kind of as the introduction went, I'm Oliver, I work for MWR. Back in 2016, this kind of journey for me started when the Bank of Bangladesh Heist happened. And it was really like curiosity trying to figure out what exactly happened, like how exactly did people pull off one of the largest heists in history. And it wasn't really something that a lot of people that I spoke to seemed to know that much about, so it got me even more interested. And I kind of went down this rabbit hole of some might say obsession with Swift to kind of start to learn as much as I could about it. And we're kind of 2 years later from that point now, at least from when I began looking into it. And so this is kind of a talk about the journey for like my learning, as well as just kind of an overview of like the different attacks that happens and kind of what's changed off the back of it all, and exactly like what is involved in like trying to steal millions and millions, potentially even billions from financial institutions. So I kind of I used to have a slide where I explained what Swift was, but I'd like to kind of just briefly assume that we all understand that it's a network for sending messages around the world. So these messages contain instructions about transferring money between banks. And that's essentially what it is. So we have banks here, Bank ABC, and we have the Swift network that links them all together. But from an attacker's perspective, that's not really what we're interested in. We're interested in the systems that make use of the network. So we kind of need to take one of these banks and like dive deep down into what it consists of. So if we take Bank A, for example, you kind of see that we have a messaging interface, something called a messaging interface, something called a communications interface. And this is like standard infrastructure that you need for a bank to connect to the Swift network. The communication interface just provides the literal connection to the network, and then the messaging interface is typically where payment messages can be manually created, but also processed automatically. So they kind of come paired together. And then on top of this, we have like a user interface that people might use. So employees, operators who create payments or who review payments, they would use this. And then we have some user also, for example, just a create and an authorize user. So someone who creates a payment, and then someone needs to authorize that payment. Otherwise, just one person could just be sending payments around all the time. And this is just a typical 4i check, but in some cases, maybe all the time, or maybe depending how much money is being sent or where, it could be even up to a 6i check. And then you obviously have like administrators who kind of manage everything, and then you have business logic systems inside the bank or the financial institution that kind of take a user from going online and saying, I want to make a payment, and processing it all the way down into this core infrastructure setup that communicates onto Swift. And there's some middleware in there to like maybe translate message formats between what they've entered as and what they need to go out, what they need to be converted into to be processed successfully. And then you have your general IT users. So this is kind of a typical now just core baseline what you need in a financial institution to communicate with Swift. So like as an attacker, what can you look at here? What would you think about attacking? Well, the reality is pretty much everything. That's the thing about attacks and like cybersecurity and hacking. Is just anything that's there is something that you can use to your advantage or try to achieve something with. And I'll get into that a little bit later. So kind of now that we all have like a brief understanding of this level, I have a timeline, which could be an entire talk in itself. So forgive me if I go through it rather quickly, but we'll just have a really quick recap on everything that's happened, at least really out there in the media over the past couple of years. So this is a specific timeline between 2013 and 2017, and 2018 will come later because it took me a long time to animate this slide, and I didn't want to add in all the 2018 things because it would take so long. But if we start with like the first well-known attack with the Sonali Bank in 2013, where about $250,000 was stolen. And this was kind of just down to keyloggers being deployed. They got the credentials they needed, and they kind of made payments as they could through that. And then we move forward like a couple of years, and we have Banco del Austro, although I don't know how to pronounce it. That was probably really, really bad. But there was 12 million stolen. And this one was purely down to email access. So someone gaining access to someone's emails who received payment instructions that had been deleted or rejected, and then just resending them, changing some of the details. It could be that easy to steal $12 million. Moving forward, 2015, there was like some more reports. I mean, nothing specific, but at least we know things are still happening. And then we kind of move forwards, and then the Vietnam attack, the Tay Phong Bank in Vietnam, 1.13 million. This was one of the more sophisticated attacks, more planned out, well thought through attacks, where the threat actors knew which PDF software operators were using to review SWIFT transactions. So they managed to get a Trojanized version of that PDF software within the bank so that when they could then create fraudulent payments, but then when the operators opened up the documents to review, the Trojanized software would change the details and it would look fine. And then we kind of move forward then to the Bank of Bangladesh, kind of where it all began, the big one everyone kind of knows about and knew, because it was an attempt at $1 billion, but only, well, saying only, 81 million was stolen, which is still quite a lot. I think they'd probably still be quite happy with that amount of money. And this was probably the peak of attacks that we've kind of seen, that this was a very well thought out attack across a long period of time. Almost an entire year throughout which this was conducted. And this was kind of one of the first times we'd seen like sophisticated malware being used and like tailored to like attack or like abuse SWIFT specific systems, but not the SWIFT network itself. It's always been down to the financial institutions, the banks, and how they manage their own infrastructure and flaws that can be found in that. And then we move forward. There was another attack, a couple more attacks in the Ukraine, not really much details we know. And then in rapid succession, right to the end of last year, there were two more attacks. One down to compromising just specific operator credentials, and another one, strangely enough, the NIC Asia Bank, although there's not all that much detail about it, one of the interesting facts was that there was remote access, at least reportedly, allowed for one of the systems used to create payment messages. And that's a problem right there, if you can remotely access these critical systems to create payment messages. Could be as easy as that. And then to kind of like just speed past this one a bit, in this year there has been quite a lot that has happened. There's been like a couple of attacks, City Union Bank, a bank in Russia. There was a bank in Malaysia, but that one was prevented. It's nice to see that things are going right sometimes. And then towards like more recently, there have been some reports coming out. So FireEye released a report relatively recently about the fact that North Korea had supposedly been targeting and abusing like SWIFT systems to steal a lot of amount of money over the years. And then SWIFT also released a warning not long ago saying that more attacks were even being seen. So taking a look at all these attacks, and believe me, I spent so much time looking into like these attacks in the research time I have at MWR, alongside the practical work I do in like reviewing these systems myself. But what kind of the trends that we kind of see? Well, a typical attack is always kind of the same. It doesn't really matter if it's SWIFT or if it's anything. It's always pretty much you have a system in the bank. An external threat will compromise the network through phishing email or through some application flaw, and we'll get a foothold. An insider threat will just use their existing access, and they're already where they need to be. Then they'll try and escalate their privileges in some way to move from generic user number 1 to admin on that computer, maybe. And then they'll use this information to do some recon. They'll look around, they'll learn about the users, they'll figure out where they want to go next. And then once they know where they want to go next, they'll then move to that computer. And then that cycle repeats and until eventually they find what their end goal is. And that could be anything. In this case, we're looking at Swift systems, so maybe the messaging interface. And then when you find that, you've reached your end goal. And then once you're done doing what you're doing, you employ anti-forensics. Restarting the machine to remove traces from memory, encrypting the malware that they use, storing it in multiple places. There's not really much you can do if you receive some malware that's encrypted because you can't really look at it. Hit my teeth there for a minute. So the timeline for these is kind of, as I said, in some cases it could be extreme, it could be years, in some cases it could be weeks, days, maybe months. But it's typically a long time, very thought out attacks, at least the ones that are successful. So kind of, I used to have like a bar chart here, but it was very boring. I thought it was very boring to look at, so I kind of made it look a bit nicer, kind of have an overview of the different kind of things you typically would see. And for the most part, we see some type of malware being deployed. We see credentials being stolen. That's a big one, because that's typically how most people get around a network. And then you've got phishing to compromise the network initially, maybe very common. Then you've got lateral movement, moving from one system to another, not always needed. For example, in the case of email access, if it can be as simple as sending an email, then you don't need to move laterally at all. Insider threats, in case like Vietnam, how did they know which PDF reader they used? Maybe it was an insider threat, maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was bribery, maybe there was blackmail, you know. And then there's remote access. One of the other examples I gave, I forgot the name, but providing remote access to critical systems, flaws that will be abused. Email access, kind of as I mentioned, and then a lot of unknowns. And there's also like a lot of little bubbles around there, all sorts of different things, but these are kind of like the big impactful things that you kind of need to watch out for that are used. So what did I think like when I began on this like journey? So I understood the Bank of Bangladesh. I knew it took a year of time. I knew it was very sophisticated, very like drawn out attack. So I kind of thought about all this and thought, I'm going to need like a year. I'm going to need a team of people before I can figure out how to compromise any of these systems. I'll need some sophisticated malware. You know, we'll have to get into the network, move around, find the right systems, and then eventually be in the right position to create some type of payment message. And then I started learning about these systems and like learning what they consist of. Well, that high-level diagram is one example, but a much more realistic one is kind of here. So you have those core systems that I mentioned, the communication interface, messaging interface, middleware, and logic systems. But then you have a lot of other systems. You have custom payment apps, you have anti-money laundering systems, you have some client-facing web application, and then you have users all around doing all sorts of different things with all sorts of abilities. On the messaging interface, you have input and verify, you have payment operators, you have security officers, and then you have the internet kind of tied in on top of all this. And you suddenly start to realize there's a lot of opportunity. So after looking at all of this stuff, and I was so confused. I was like, I wonder why this doesn't happen all the time. And actually, I forgot I was going to go to an example here. Whereas in the messaging interface, we can kind of try and send payments out. For example, if we're going to compromise that specifically. Upstream systems is, you know, you kind of target in the middle. So if you've got a payment application where a user creates a payment, it's then processed. But if I push a payment straight to one of these systems in the middle, it may implicitly trust that it was legitimate because it wasn't expecting to receive anything that was never legitimate. So it's kind of abuse of trust relationships between systems. Then you've got like these enrichment systems as well that kind of translate messages. So you'll get a message that will come in, and maybe if it meets a certain rule, they will change certain values. But if you can compromise this system, maybe I can create an instruction that when it receives a payment to user A, it actually swaps that round so that I suddenly become the recipient of that payment, things like that. And then you have custom payment apps. So a lot of places have in-house built systems. And from an attacker perspective, that's much more interesting to me because it's new and it's custom and it's probably got a lot of problems with it because that's what security is. You improve things over time, especially when they're brand new. So as I was kind of saying before, I forgot a big chunk of my presentation there. What do I kind of think now? Well, I thought, okay, so I could probably get on the network. Maybe it's flat. Maybe I can go straight to the messaging interface and send a payment out. It could be as easy as that. Maybe they don't have two-factor authentication, all these things. And I was like, it really could be that. Or even if it's not that simple, Perhaps, I just go for one of these logic systems, as I mentioned, try and get a payment in there, and everything will trust that it's fine, and a payment will go out. So it kind of sounds really easy, right, from what I'm saying. It's so easy to steal lots of money. There's so much opportunity. So if that's the case, if that's all true, what I've just told you, why isn't this me? Why am I here talking to you guys instead of sitting on an island somewhere, like just with money, throwing it in the air? Well, the reality is, hacking is kind of the easy part. Kind of trying to make a payment instruction go out is probably the easy part of these attacks. Easy is not really a way of saying it, but the easiest part. But in reality, it takes a considerable amount more than that. Like, to be successful, like for the Bank of Bangladesh to try and steal $1 billion, you're going to need fake identities, you're going to need shell companies to send money to, you're going to need to maybe bribe some people to get those companies in place and those fake identities, then you're going to need to be ready to receive a huge amount of money, which is not an easy thing to do. Everyone wants money, but if you received $1 billion, what do you do at that point? How do you keep it safe? How do you stop it being found? So you need to know how to launder money and kind of get it out of the system and clean it. And for that, you're going to need to employ like mules, people to be in different parts of the world ready with a backpack to draw out money and then run. And then maybe go to like a casino somewhere, and then you can launder it in the casino, get it out of the system, and then you maybe control the casino, so that's how you can get the money back. And this all takes like criminal organizations, like well-structured criminal organizations in cooperation. It's not just some hacker, some activist trying to steal some money. This is serious, serious business. But the problem is, it's all very error-prone, which is, for the most part, why these things fail, because it's so easy to go wrong in so many of these places. And the simplest things can just devastate your attack completely. And just to kind of take an example, let's take a closer look at the Bangladesh heist. So it starts at the Bank of Bangladesh, and they send 35 payment messages out, which are just instructions over the SWIFT network to move money between banks. 30 messages are blocked straight away because there was a word juniper in the messages that hit a sanctions list. It wasn't like necessarily the recipient, it was just a string, a message in the message, and it was hit, so immediately rejected. That's flaw number one. That's $870 million you've just lost because of that. And then another message was blocked because there was a typo. I think foundation was spelled fundation. But then only 4 messages got through. And 4 messages at $81 million. And then those funds then go from that bank and go through this Philrem remittance service to kind of launder it. And then they're sent to 3 different banks around the world, some of them physically, people with physical bags, kind of as I mentioned, putting it in a van, driving somewhere, where eventually it all ends up with the attackers. And I'm sure they had a lot of people to then pay with that $81 million, and maybe only ended up with like a tenner left. So if it's that difficult in that case, we've gone from it being super easy to it being just godly difficult, then why should you even care if as a financial institution, as a bank, why is this even a threat if it's so difficult? Well, the reality of this is that the only thing that matters at all is this first stage right here. That is enough to just destroy your reputation. Like, it doesn't even matter if you get all of the money back. Once it's out there that you lost the money in the first place, that it was stolen, there's no coming back from that. And because here I am, for example, talking about all these banks. I'm sure they would prefer I didn't speak about them. But here we are as a reminder of why these things are so serious. So what kind of happened off the back of this? There's actually a lot of changes that have happened over the past couple of years, which is it's encouraging. It's good to see. But just a really good example is a SWIFT CSP, for example. So on March 2017, SWIFT introduced their customer security program. At the time, it was a set of 27 rules, but I think now it's this 2019 version. I think it's around 29 rules. And some of them are mandatory, some of them are advisory, but they're basically just a guideline of what you must do if you are a SWIFT customer. You must attest that you have done these security controls, implemented all these requirements, and everyone can view it. So every other SWIFT customer can go to and look up a bank and say, okay, they've attested. I know that they have this baseline of security. And it's good, but what does it really consist of? So for the most part, it kind of consists of 3 principles. And those are secure your environment, know and limit access, and detect and respond, which are all very high-level ways of saying to just secure everything, basically. And these break down then into these 27 controls, which are all very technical ways of saying all these things. But the harsh reality of that is that that's what I've been telling people to do every day for the past 2 years. Why does it take a multi-million-dollar heist for someone to take our advice seriously as security consultants in the industry? It's beyond me, believe me. But, so what does it do? Let's take Swift CSP, for example. What does it do? Well, it takes this diagram that we have of what a bank looks like, and it puts a red box around all the Swift systems. And that's basically it. That's as much as it changes. But the important thing to know is that there are 2 blue lines just there that are still in that red box. And that's it. That's all you need to know. There are 2 blue lines, and those 2 blue lines go through the red box. So this red area is called a secure zone. And in my mind, a secure zone is something that's kind of isolated and secure. And in reality, that's kind of what they've tried to get. They've tried to harden all this, isolate it, segregate it as well as possible, make sure there are strong security-like controls and process and policies in place on these systems so that they know that they're safe, or at least there's a baseline across everyone to have a certain amount of security on these core systems. And that's good, but they're not isolated. They're still connected to all these other systems. Otherwise, there'd just be a load of servers sat in a room doing nothing, and no one would be making any payments. But they might be very secure at that point, but quite useless. So what that does is it keeps the attackers back there, and if anything, it makes them focus their attacks up there. In fact, it makes them really focus their attention up there, and because you're not really planning to place as much care maybe on those systems because CSP fixing all these Swift systems is very important and takes a lot of resources. Well, they're probably going to find a way back in, and once they're back in, they can do the exact same things they did before, and it results in payment messages going out. So CSP and controls and all these types of things are good, and they all have a lot of worth and value in them, but they're very focused. It's not a silver bullet to everything. It's a silver bullet maybe to Swift-specific systems, but there's a lot more than that makes a bank and a financial institution work in terms of connecting to Swift. So what do we need to do now? Well, CSP is good, do that, but then also focus your attention everywhere else. You need to take that mindset that you've just placed on doing these controls and do it everywhere. And I mean, it's easier said than done, but that is the truth. That's what you need to do. You need to place your focus on security and everything that you're doing well and good. You need to do it everywhere. You can't just do it in one place. So you need to secure these systems, make sure they're just as safe. Otherwise, the attackers are going to abuse the trust relationships between them and the Swift infrastructure. So kind of some closing notes, just 2 main points I kind of want to leave you with, is that kind of as we secure the Swift systems, as I mentioned, it's all good, but attackers will adapt and they'll move, and we need to make sure that these upstream systems are secure as well. Because most of the time, that's where the flaws are. I've looked at systems from one extreme to the left, where it's just a front-end web application, all through a bank's systems, internal systems, all the way up to where they communicate to Swift. And a lot of the times, there are just flaws in between that need to be fixed or could be abused. And secondly, it's just that, yeah, okay. I thought it went to a different slide then. Depending on the payment infrastructure, you need to understand how attackers work to be secure. You can't just do a load of pen tests and think that's fine, hit a load of compliance and think that's fine. You need to understand how the attackers work and then build your defenses around that so that you can work against them. Because you need to know what you're up against, otherwise you're never going to defend yourself against them well. So that's kind of it. There was just a quick slide on some resources that we've written up over the year on Swift-specific stuff, but it's probably just as easy to Google MWR Swift, and you might see this as opposed to trying to take a picture. But that's kind of everything I had. Hopefully it was interesting.
Am I on? Yes. Thank you very much, Ollie, for a stirring talk. Do we have questions in the room? There is one at the back.
Regardless how complete the CSP is, my question is, how do SWIFT test the compliance reports?
So is the question is, how do SWIFT test the compliance?
Yeah. How do they check the assessments which are done by the banks or customers?
Okay. So the principle behind the CSP program is that the customers, the SWIFT customers, so the financial institutions, are all obliged to attest their compliance to all these things. So over the past 2 years, there have been like one deadline coming up very shortly on the 1st of January, but the first one was January this year, where they had to confirm that they had controls in place, or they had things that they were going to work on in the next year to then be fully compliant with all this stuff. And then on January the 1st, 2019, that's when they need to attest that all of this has been done and it's good. And then they will publish that like within the SWIFT community so that everyone can see. And that's kind of where it's placed. And then if they're not compliant with these things, then there's a lot of, I think, hefty fines that will come people's way. So I think that's probably the incentive. As you could lose a lot from an attack, but you could also lose a lot from regulatory fines.
Good, thank you. Different question. One at the back, over there.
Hi, Oliver. Oh, sorry. I have a question. In the beginning of your presentation, you showed all these breaches, and most of the banks, they were in South Asia and in South America. Is there a reason for that? Are Western banks more secure, or what's the conclusion?
So this is a really good question. I'm glad this asked, because I find this quite fascinating. So there was, in the past, I've kind of had like a slide to kind of pinpoint where all the attacks have been so that we can kind of have a view. But in reality, I think it's that countries with a less mature like security kind of posture, or less maturity in terms of technology and security in general, they're much softer targets. If I was going to like target a bank or a financial institution trying to steal money, I wouldn't go for the bank with big walls and a guard dog, like maybe in the US or in some of the European countries. I'd go for what I would consider maybe weaker targets in terms of their maturity. So I think that's why those attacks happen in those parts of the world, because they're kind of progressing, but they're slightly behind the other parts of the world in terms of their practices in cybersecurity.
Okay. There is another question up there. We still have time and nobody's hungry.
So thank you very much, first of all, for this interesting speech. On one of your slides, you showed different attack vectors that are like keyloggers, malware, and so on. But what worries me is that there was also an unknown. So did that mean that for specific cases it was not known what happened? Or are there any attack vectors that are not known yet and we still have to find out?
So the unknown kind of point is more about how the investigations progress. So there's a lot of stuff that people can know and people can see, but there's also a lot of things that aren't confirmed most of the time, and it's kind of just to compensate for that lack of me not being able to just tell you that there's for a fact that this is everything.
Good. Not seeing any additional questions. Oh, there is one. Oh, Corey's on. Okay, we'll take you and we'll move over to Corey afterwards.
In your graphic, you showed a lot of banks which have probably direct connection to SWIFT network. A lot of small businesses or companies also use the service providers. Do you have examples there? Because that's a bottleneck, and they can really, if they attack those service providers, they can also do significant damage. Not just impacting one client maybe, but more clients. There were examples in the past on attacks on service providers?
So it's correct. There are not just financial institutions and banks that use the SWIFT services. Myself personally, in terms of what I've done and what I've researched, what I've worked on, I can't say whether or not, or have any good examples that I could offer, unfortunately.
Good. We're taking a final question. Corey volunteered here in the front. Mike is coming.
So when I moved to the US a couple of years ago, I started banking with a small credit union, and they don't have their own SWIFT number because they're tinsy. And they said, if anyone needs to send you money from overseas, give them the SWIFT number of any US bank in America, and they will forward the money to us. And it's like an open SMTP relay. And weirdly enough, this works. It actually, like, that's how I get paid from non-US payments. They literally, I can give them any SWIFT number for any bank in America, and the money gets forwarded to me. Have you seen this as an attack vector? This feels insecure, right?
So that's like an interesting kind of perspective. I think there's some things to kind of understand about that. So in terms of like not having like a SWIFT code and being like a member, that's kind of used for like you being a member and having direct connection to the network and allowing all this automation and fast straight-through processing type processes. In reality, it's kind of correspondent banking at the end of the day. If you need to get money from one bank to another, as long as they have a business relationship with a chain of banks in between, the money will get to you. And that's kind of all that's happening there. I'm not sure if maybe any bank in America, unless they just go to any bank and draw the money out, but perhaps maybe any bank that they have a business relationship with in America, that would work. Well, in the terms of an attack vector, right, that type of correspondent banking is the way that if you compromise some bank A and they don't necessarily have a business relationship directly to the bank where I have my accounts, my accounts for where I want to hold all the money, then I'll need to abuse that type of system to get the funds where I need them to go. But depending how many steps there are in between, this can either be relatively easy and automated and processed relatively quickly with no human interaction, or if there are too many banks involved, then it typically ends up being a manual process and things will kind of get picked up there. So there are things in place to notice these types of things. That's an interesting
Very good.
question.
Thank you very much, Ollie. Round of applause for you. Here is your chocolate.